Well, good afternoon to everybody for the last time this year. And thank you again for supporting summer school and supporting me. Think of two great rivers. Think of two rivers that are pouring down from two mountains and they're colliding. As they collide, there's a great cauldron of water as they move together towards the sea. That's the kind of image you want to keep in your mind as we think about the 19th century. We're going on now with the last lecture about figure artists in the 19th century. May I just ask if this sound is all right or if it's echoey or too loud? Okay, yeah? Right. Okay. Well, I was thinking as I was coming here and looking at the mountains, just imagine two mighty rivers with coming from entirely different places and colliding into this great cauldron, which is the 19th century. At the end of the century, we're going to be hanging by our fingernails, and the 20th century is about to burst upon us. So today I'm going to go on with the story that we looked at yesterday. Pretty much, I hope, seamlessly. So in the 19th century in Paris, if you wanted to be in the show at all, please come and sit down here. If you want to be in the show at all, you need to be part of the École de Beaux-Arts. And it was very difficult to get into. Most people were routinely failed. Of course, Cézanne was failed the moment he came to Paris, and most people would be failed over and over again. If you got in, you pretty much had a ticket to some form of success. But as you can see, it's an all-male preserve. The students are male, and the model is male, and the professors are all male, and the juries are all male, and the salon is all male. When I look, I put that in because rather nice archive photo, and it shows you the male model posing in what I think he thinks is a proper classical attitude, with the shoulder one way, the head turning, and the hip. And that's meant to be the classical contrapposto, but as you will know if you were here yesterday, it's not, because that's really a walking posture. And if you look at the proper contrapposto, it is a static attitude with the weight on the inside of the weight-bearing leg. You're looking at a pair of incredible legs, of course, and the contrast between the amazing texture of the marble and the heavy weight of the drapery is absolutely extraordinary. But you can see the figure is standing still. And then the hips, of course, move to the side. So this is the high classical gold standard, which every art student would need to master. The body position, the proportions of head to the body, all based on the great Greek sculptors. And the one you're looking at is actually Praxiteles. So Praxiteles here, in the middle of the 4th century, it shows the god Hermes holding the baby Dionysos. Not only is the figure idealized, but the head, indeed, also the face, is idealized. With this gold standard, you come to this idea of the neoclassical, which is one of the mighty rivers that I mentioned, the neoclassical river. In order to understand that, you need to study an awful lot of Greek sculpture and Greek plaster casts, and you need to be familiar with the Greek sculptors. You also need then to be able to do drawings in the high style, which is indeed, this is a romantic style, where the head is turned back, the eyes are cast up, there's an emotion about it. You can imagine the burnt body turning. This is a drawing by Alphonse Le Gros. It's simply a head study, but it tells you straight away that this student, Alphonse Le Gros, has absorbed everything from the Hellenistic, which is the last period of Greek art, going into Roman art, where emotion and the twisting body becomes the key idea. Just to say, for the girl who just came in, I did say there were two great rivers coming down the mountain, and they joined together into a great cauldron which is the 19th century. The one river is neoclassicism and the other river is romanticism. So here you have a very nice example of the kind of studio drawing that you do if you're a student at the École des Beaux-Arts. Both of these threads, or rather rivers, fed the French Revolution in different ways. Both were equally dangerous because, of course, neoclassicism was drawn largely on Roman ideas in the 19th century, which included the Roman Republic. So the French Revolution was promoting the idea of eliminating monarchy and establishing a republic. Everything about the Republican Rome appealed to them, and in a way neoclassicism was promoting that every inch of the way. On the other hand, Romanticism was very, very dangerous because Romanticism was a Pandora's box. You opened that box and out came emotion, passion. Romanticism is all about starry skies and the moon and death and passion and people dying at night and so on. Romanticism came from Northern Europe. It is really a romantic movement. And it was mainly originally in literature, but then finally came through into art. Romanticism legitimized a great splurge of emotion, which is exactly what was stimulated by the French Revolution, while neoclassicism raised the hopes of a republic, which was very dangerous again in the monarchy of France. So I hope I've just explained for Alan, who just came in, we've got neoclassicism and romanticism, two entirely different threads which both stimulate the French Revolution and which we are running through the 19th century. So this drawing here by Ingres shows you that you had to, if you're a good student, you also had to be able to draw drapery. Drapery is key to so many of those great Roman and Greek sculptures. The drawing of drapery, very important, and it was really in the middle of the 19th century that the great Nike of Samothrace was discovered by the French. And she was discovered in about 180 pieces and reconstructed. But she is the archetypal Hellenistic sculpture. When I say Hellenistic, that comes after the archaic, the early classical, high classical. Hellenistic goes on into the Roman period and is a period of immense amount of emotion and movement in sculpture. You see the drapery here is absolutely astounding. With the wind blowing, it's wet. She's coming down, landing on the prow of a ship and bringing the news of victory. So Nike, if you've got any Nike trainers, that means victory in Greek. Now, the classical thing, so the neoclassicists, very much led by Ingres, right? And Ingres then assumed the role of the guardian of academic orthodoxy against the rising romantic style, which was exemplified by Eugène Delacroix, who I showed you yesterday in that odalisque. Remember? The odalisque with the eunuch servant and everything. So this is very, very, very famous as an example of a neoclassical nude painted in the early 19th century, copied by very many young would-be artists. You have a twist of the head. You see it from the back view. You're looking almost as an object. You're not looking at a woman. There's absolutely nothing erotic about it. And there she is. And it was Ingres was drawing on one of the most famous of all Greek sculptures, which was the Venus of Cnidos. The Aphrodite of Cnidos was considered to be one of the Praxiteles' greatest artworks, and it was the first nude female figure probably in Greek history. And there are many stories about how people were simply blown away by her beauty. I've put this to show you the back of the Cnidian Aphrodite, to show you how closely Ingres would have looked at that. In other words, I think I've now fixed it, that the neoclassical tradition is strongly embedded in the early 19th century. Now, that is her from the front, but that is a Roman copy. And the head, we don't know if the head is actually her head or a copy, but still, it's a very precious head in the Louvre. and her date then 350 BC. Now, the young artist that was most influenced by this tradition was Seurat, Georges Seurat. Today I'm going to talk about Seurat, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Rodin, and then Gauguin. So Seurat basically was neoclassical by spirit and inclination, and he was the only one of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists who went to the Beaux-Arts. He was the only one that had a formal art education. That probably explains quite a lot, doesn't it? He's very gentle. Look what a lovely face he has. Very gentle, terribly sensitive, and very, very sensitive to abstract feelings and ideas, which he finds in ordinary everyday people and objects. This woman sitting here has been reduced to a very static image. His drawings are absolutely extraordinary because you have a sense of mysterious or luminous luminosity. It's a kind of luminous investigation of shape and form. You have the light of the arm. The shape finds itself against the edge of the shadow, and on this side exactly the opposite, the back of the dress picked up by the light behind, and this play of light moving around the figure, finding the shapes, and he is really responding to a sort of abstract impulse when he looks at the images. His work is very static. That's also quite a classical feature, because all the movement comes in with the high classical and Hellenistic period. So it's quite static. He's searching for forms. He's not interested in personality or movement or anything. This is one of the figures from his great painting, The Bathers at Asnières, which is in the National Gallery. Even to the extent of drawing the legs over and over again, he is searching constantly for the right sort of form, which, because of his desire to find the abstract balances of things. When you look into the background of this work here, you see a strange, scrabbly, sort of foggy tone through which the light seems to penetrate, and somehow in this fog of tone, the forms emerge. He's not what you would call a linear painter. He is about miles away from someone like Alessandro Botticelli, who was the great exponent of the high international Gothic style, which is very, very fluid and very linear. You know, you made lines and then you colored them in. I mean, that's a bit crude, but the point was, Botticelli and that was very linear. It was all about design. But here with Seurat, you've got something quite different. He's searching for forms. They've been called the most beautiful painter's drawings in existence. And I put this in, even though it's not a figure, to show you how he could respond to quite simply 4 trees, and how they arise from the mist, how the edge of the edge here, I don't know if you can see it, of the grass sort of merges into the lake. He was very, very sensitive. Sadly, he actually caught meningitis when he was 31, and he died at a very young age of 31, and his baby that had just been born also caught it. But if I think Seurat had not died at 31, I think Pablo Picasso would have had a run for his money, because Picasso was born in 1881, and he was 10 years old when Seurat died. He only had to live another 10 years or so. So that's what I feel. Now, in this rather extraordinary drawing, which set the stage for his great painting of La Grande Jatte, which is in Chicago, he's put one tiny touch of light, which is this little dog in the foreground, and he made a very special drawing of her. There she is. Again, how beautiful is that? It reminds me of George Stubbs, the great animal painter of England, or even Albert Dürer, perhaps. So I've dedicated this drawing to Lola. I don't have Lola's mums here today. A very special little dog who can't walk, but she can talk. And she's paralyzed. She's very brave. I don't think her mum's here today. So Georges Seurat, then, working to paint a view from the background, is quite clearly passing through this tradition of Ingres and back to Praxiteles. Very classical, very static, and all about finding the forms. He literally melts the edges of his forms with this process of dots, which was called pointillism. He believed that the colors could be mixed in the eye rather than actually on the canvas. But as you can see, he's not interested in personality, he's not interested in drama, not interested in storytelling, he is really interested in abstraction. That's why I say, if only he'd lived 10 or 20 years, he would have been way ahead of Picasso, I think, possibly. This is another little figure study of Seurat to show how he just dissolves the forms in order to find them. All his work has an amazing control. When you look at it, you may not immediately realize how the black up there is just offset by this strong horizontal black line. You look at it with half-closed eyes, it's a perfectly balanced, tiny, tiny little painting where the form is emerging through these dissolving shapes. As I've already said, his work is very static, and his figures, this is a very good example, a figure seated on the grass with a very defined form that he's searched out very, very carefully, but quite unlike all the movement and energy that we had through Delacroix and all the fluffiness that we had with the Rococo paintings that we saw in the lectures on flowers, just very controlled. These little paintings were made on the back of cigar box lids. He was very poor, so he went into all the cafes and just asked for the backs of the cigar boxes. And he made these, that's why you can see, these are tiny brushstrokes, but when you see it on this great big screen, it looks big. They're very small. And even in something as small as this, you have a very acute sense of composition and tone, with these three great big diagonals across the front and the bending and stooping woman. There's a very slight subtext to this little painting, which strikes me as interesting, which is the fact that after the revolution, there was a great sense of the dignity of labor, that people who were working people were regarded as great as people who were brain surgeons, that there was a tremendous revision, let's say, of the attitude to working on the land. And many artists portrayed that. Vincent van Gogh frequently portrayed haystacks, and so did Manet. The haystack was a symbol of the revolution. It was a great symbol of eternal France and the abundance of France. So these figures are stooping because people who work and stoop are really exhibiting humility. They bend to the ground. I think I mentioned in my first flower lecture that the word for ground is humus. Humility comes from that. So they're bending and stooping. And this would have been a model in the back of the mind of God, what's his name? I've just forgotten. Oh, Seurat, sorry. In the back of the mind of Seurat, as he made that painting, he would have thought about Jean-François Millet's famous painting, The Gleaners. The gleaners could go around the field when the harvest was in and pick up anything they found around the edges. That was scriptural. It comes from the Old Testament, that one of the things the Israelites were required to do was to leave the gleanings for the people that had nothing. So gleaners, again, the poorest of the poor, shown here stooping and bending to search for just tiny little bits. So we move on from Seurat to a character we all know, we think we know, I mean, I think he's quite mysterious, and that is Toulouse-Lautrec, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. So he was 7 years younger than Seurat, and he came from a rather different sort of background. He was not from Paris. He came from the south, from near Toulouse, and he was a noble. Inasmuch as anybody was noble in France in the 19th century, because most of them had been killed in the Terror, he was descended from 1,000 years of the lords of Toulouse, the dukes of Toulouse. So he really was from that background. Tragedy struck when he was very young, because he had, I think, a riding accident. His legs didn't knit properly, and he was obviously from a rich and distinguished family, so he suffered from over-doctoring, like so many people who come from rich families. And the doctors re-broke his legs several times. I don't want to think about it because I don't think chloroform existed then. This poor child was tortured. Consequently, the legs never grew. He was not a dwarf or anything. He was a perfectly normal man, but his legs didn't grow. That wrecked his life completely. Here you see he shows you without the rest of his body, and he shows you himself almost as part of a still life. And he's in a mirror. You can see that because you've got the candle reflected there. But he shows himself as serious and determined, good-looking. He's quite young. He's at home, in fact. It's 1882-83. It's just slightly possible that he'd seen Manet's last great work, which was the bar at the Folies Bergère, which was entirely a reflection in a mirror, apart from the girl, which was, of course, Manet's last great work. So you look at him, he's really intensely concentrating. And his family encouraged him to paint because he couldn't ride, which was his great love. When he paints a painting about the countryside, it's a very different thing from the way that Seurat sees, or Millet. He doesn't see anything to do with the workers. He sees a Sunday afternoon where the family go out and lie around in the haystacks in the gorgeous warmth, and he makes a rather nice composition, pretty much in two colors or two tones, just ochre and black. And this is 1884, and at this point he hadn't really hit the bottle very seriously, and he hadn't got up to Montmartre. This is his mother, who he painted a lot, Madame la Comtesse Adèle de Toulouse-Lautrec, who was a very, very sad woman. She'd had to see her poor beloved son suffering so appallingly. This painting, if you saw it among a collection of works by Pissarro, you wouldn't be surprised. It is very much for the time, very much how you painted, with light key, light colors, out of doors by natural light. But he could have been a very good portrait painter. All he needed was a bit of support. This is a very good portrait of Émile Bernard, who was a big friend of Cézanne's as well, friend of all of them actually. And I think it's a lovely portrait. He's quite young, but you can see he's intellectual, he's alert, he's gentle, and I think it's a lovely, very, very nice portrait indeed. Unfortunately, that wasn't what was going to happen. But I want to show you a few, as it were, paintings of Toulouse, and not just all those wood blocks that he made. So here are two very good portraits. The one on the left is Rosa the Red. It's Rosa the Red here. And it looks like a candid snap, as if she was facing him and she looked sideways. And he sort of he caught that look. You see, Rosa the Red is one of the indigenous animal life of Montmartre. These girls were living in Montmartre. And she has that a defensive, aggressive attitude, which is probably what you needed to survive in Montmartre. Her hair coming down in two horns also gives us a rather an aggressive look. But in the background, the way the background is divided into these tones, 1, 2, 3, 4, and all the rest, reds and rusts and browns, are very much influenced by Degas, we talked about yesterday. On the right-hand side, there's the woman with the black boa, who is 100% in charge of herself and everybody else, very confident, hand on hip, very much a woman of her place and time, and probably quite dangerous. But I think Toulouse-Lautrec captures that. He is a painter of modern life, not the first. It's always said that Manet was the first painter of modern life. And I've called my talk on Manet, master of the modern idiom, because yes, he was. But here you have Toulouse-Lautrec painting modern life, real, not duchesses and things like just ordinary people. Another picture of Rosa the Red, again showing the strong influence of Degas. Does anybody remember yesterday I showed you Melancholia, the Degas painting where the woman is leaning right over this way. It was very red, she had a white collar. Do you remember that? I discussed the extremely abnormal and asymmetrical composition. You remember that? Well, here we are. Something starts to change when he starts going to the Folies Bergère and to the circus, which, as I mentioned, they all went to the circus all the time. And he begins to look at uplighting, where the figure is lit up from underneath like that. When you see the uplighting, you know that you're in a theatrical context. And the uplighting happened simply because the stage had limelight across the front. You've heard about hogging the limelight, yeah? Well, the stage had limelight right across the front, which lit up the figures, the dancers, from below. And I couldn't get online just this morning from where I stay, so I couldn't find the very famous image of the Degas singer who's like that, with her face lit up from underneath. So it's not only the uplighting, but I think it's also the technique, the scratchy technique beginning to appear, that tells us that he is now coming under the influence of Degas. He's in Montmartre. And Montmartre was a dangerous place for a young man to be. Montmartre means the Mount of Martyrs. Originally, there were people martyred on that mountain, on that hill, and there are many modern martyrs of people whose lives were destroyed by being Montmartre. One of them was Amedeo Modigliani, who completely abandoned his background and all his education and sort of cast himself adrift as an outsider. He didn't even stay in the main village of Montmartre. He stayed on the Maquis, which is on the back of the hill. And of course, not only did he kill himself, but he killed Jean Hebertin, his beautiful mistress, who, I don't want to go there, basically. But these were only a few. Many people, because of absinthe, which is so very poisonous. So you can see, when you remember yesterday, can you not see the technique very much reflecting Degas? Can you see it? Yeah? You can see what's happening. Degas was still alive, because he actually survived into the First World War, Degas. So he lived a long time. But he was definitely very much alive when Toulouse was in Montmartre. Another one, again, which shows this flickering brushstroke, which is not the dots of Seurat, not the dots of pointillism, but little flickering lines, which again he's getting from Degas, but not as strong as Degas. He hasn't got the confidence. And this woman clearly is an ordinary woman from the hill. I don't know what her job is, but she's up on Montmartre. Another one, where Toulouse is now painting a figure from the back view. It's all about hair. There's no eye contact. And it's, again, almost not quite monochromatic, but it's in very simple palette. And we talked about Degas showing nearly all his figures from the back view, didn't we? Do you remember what I said yesterday about that? That he was like a peeping Tom, looking through the hole in the door, seeing these women naked in their bath from behind the door. They don't know he's there. They never look over their shoulder. You never see their eyes. They never communicate with the artist. They are objects. And this again, this very small little work, I'm putting in to try and show you how he came under that influence. But of course, the big attraction was the circus. And I'm delighted to tell you, and a big sorry to anybody who's French in the audience, that the Cirque Fernando, which was originally called the Cirque Medrano, was actually an English circus. I was astounded when I found out that. It changed its name from Medrano to Fernando, and it was right at the bottom of Montmartre in this enormous big pink tent-like building, and that is where everybody gathered. Everybody. So this shows Toulouse finding his feet with a particular genre and using very dramatic color, the yellow going right up there and onto the hair, and showing the woman again in an awkward position from the back with the elbow raised, which comes again from the influence of... Well done. Okay, so just making sure you're awake. He also does many, many drawings of women that are not women they're not stylish women of Paris, they are the women of Montmartre, and he often shows women in bed together, which was, again, a little racy at the time, but these women were his friends. He made many drawings of people in brothels. They were his friends. They were people that he knew. And he made very many drawings. And in this, you see this man here with his hat on. You know that you never took your hat off? If you went to visit somebody for tea, you went right into the drawing room, sat down, took off your hat and put it on the carpet next to you. If you went into one of the cafe concerts to have a snifterino, a little drink or something, you didn't take your hat off. So it's a bit tough on anybody behind you. They wouldn't have been able to see the stage. But the point was you never took your hat off. This is why it's one of the characteristics of the Impressionist paintings that there are so many top hats, particularly in Manet's work. The can-can was the big thing, and we have to look at the can-can because, of course, he illustrated the can-can. This is a picture of Jane Avril doing the can-can, and it first appeared in the working-class dance halls of Montparnasse. So that's down on the other side of Paris, way down on the other side, on the left bank. It's actually where Gertrude Stein had her house and her pavilion, and it's where the Montmartre set moved when the magic went out of Montmartre later on. So around 1830, the can-can becomes a dance, and it was originally a dance for couples. So it involved a lot of high kicks and other gestures with arms and legs, and it was known as la chahoute. So it might have been Algerian. I think that's quite interesting. And it also meant the can-can itself. Can-can meant tittle-tattle or scandal. And chahoute meant uproar. So you can see it was all in the name. Of course, there were attempts to repress the can-can because people thought it was immoral, but nothing really worked. Jane Avril was not English. People have loved to say that Jane Avril was English. You can see her here. So they gave themselves wonderful names. Eglantine, Jane Avril, Cleopatra, Gazelle. And they all look incredibly fierce, don't they? Look at this one. Amazingly fierce. So Jane Avril actually had an illness which made her jitter all the time. And she was even taken to that awful hospital in Paris where very serious doctors were discussing things like hysteria, which only women had, of course, because it was linked to their wombs and the behavior of their wombs, and therefore only women had hysteria. And they did the most awful experiments on some of these girls. So this girl had some kind of jittery illness, and she would dance in this very jittery way. She was absolutely French, but one of her lovers said, why don't you give yourself an English name to be a bit more classy? So she called herself Jane Avril, and Paris in the late 19th century was absolutely the destination of choice for sexual tourism. Everybody, even the Prince of Wales, went to Paris. Of course, Oscar Wilde died in Paris, so Jane Avril is actually French. Sorry about that. Well, here is La Goulou, who was one of the great exponents of the can-can, painted as a proper painting. But here you see again the top hat right there, yeah? And she's being supported by two girls, or a girl and a man. She's quite clearly, she is somebody. In today's world, she'd be a celeb, she'd be on Twitter and everything else. So she was one of the great can-can dancers. And as you might notice, I put this for you here. When you see something in my notes, do understand I've done it for a reason. I have to choose what goes on here. I can't put everything. The reason I put all on cardboard is because it shows that they were really quite poor, these artists. Well, lots of people were painting on cardboard. Toulouse himself probably wasn't poor, but painting on cardboard was quite a normal thing to do. So she was a great can-can dancer. There she is, doing her can-can. Of course, the camera, you had to freeze in those days, so she had to hold her leg. She couldn't actually have a picture in movement. And there she is. And when she died, she even got a mention in the paper. And there she is. La Goulou est morte. But can-can was a great thing. Here they are all doing can-can together. They're probably all members of the Folies Bergère, off for the afternoon. And I must say one thing about La Goulou. Her name was Louise Weber. Did I show you that? Yes, her name is Louise. She's buried in Montmartre Cemetery. And the great thing was she really, really was, and she knew how to party. But Seurat also tried to paint them, but when Seurat painted them, he froze them. I've already explained how all his work was so static. So he sort of froze these can-can dancers. And there she is, and boy, did she know how to party. Look at her. Isn't she gorgeous? I mean, she's just wonderful. Amazing. Now, it does remind me a little bit of a famous remark by Paul Gauguin. He talked about the disease of civilization and why he went to Tahiti to get away from the disease of civilization. So in a sense, he might have been thinking about something like this. Now we go from this to a totally different mood, everybody. Change brains. We are going to now look at Auguste Rodin. And Rodin is quite simply one of the greatest sculptors, I think, ever after the Greeks, because of the passion and the emotion that he manages to imbue into his works, and because he never took no for an answer. I mean, he would make his figures do anything he wanted them to do. So here you see him quite young, with very intense expression, and his muse, Camille Claudel, a beautiful girl. Rodin was powerful in every possible way. He went north, he went to Brussels, or somewhere in Holland, I think it was Brussels, where he spent about 6 years working in a foundry, learning about bronze casting. He knew everything about his craft. And he worked, most of his works were cast in bronze. They were made often in plaster or in clay, or if they were small, maybe in wax. This is one of his very early works from 1864, Bibi, and it was just an old tramp that he made a portrait of. But you can see that he's kind of raised this old tramp to almost be a portrait of somebody like Socrates, one of the great Greek philosophers. You see that he was steeped in that tradition. He was so very, very gifted that he was able to travel. He probably had prize money. He was able to travel all the way down to Italy and visit the great works of Michelangelo. I suppose he saw the dying slaves and all those other great works, and indeed the paintings, and probably the Greek or the Roman copies of Greek sculpture that he would have seen in Rome. So he's deeply steeped in the classical tradition, but at heart he's a man of his own time, and he is a burning romantic. This is why his work is going to get very interesting in a minute. This is one of his very early works, which shows him referencing the great Greek sculptors, and it's called The Vanquished, but it was also called The Age of Bronze. And you see 1860 to 1880, in 1876, in 1871, I think something like 125,000 French soldiers had to surrender to the Prussian army outside Paris. And the collapse of the Franco-Prussian War and the loss of that, the surrender, was a very, very big thing for France. So when he called it The Vanquished, that wasn't popular, so I think he changed the name to The Age of Bronze. Originally, the figure might have had a spear, which in the Greek world was the weapon of choice. For example, Theseus, the great hero of Athens, is always shown with a spear. And if you read the Iliad, which you all need to read, starting tomorrow, no, I'm absolutely serious. If you haven't read the Iliad by this time next year, I'm not coming. I'm thinking next year of doing 5 lectures all on ancient Greece, because I've got my new research to present. Anyway, basically, in the Iliad, you put down your spear, you go and talk to somebody, you come out of his tent, you pick up your spear, you go somewhere else, you put down your spear. You're never separated. But you see, the hand on the head in Greek was an attitude of mourning. I think he's referencing the great bronzes, like, for example, the bronze, this is called the Piraeus Apollo, a totally amazing bronze, hollow bronze. He was very lucky that he survived, unlike most of his brothers and sisters and cousins who were melted down to make weapons. You know, when you think of it, the loss. Bronze casting is very technical and very, very difficult, and they reached the incredibly high level of achievement in the 5th century. So this is actually late 6th, so this is late archaic. When you look at this figure, his chest is lifting because it's full of the breath of God, the pneuma theou in Greek. They believed so much. His head is very poised. There's nothing arrogant about his face. The light shines on a very strong nose, very high forehead, and on his chin. He's completely poised, as well he should be, because he's carrying in this hand a little bit of his whip, which tells us that he's really not Apollo. He's a heniokos. A heniokos is a charioteer. And charioteers took their life in their hands every single time they got in a chariot. It was terribly dangerous. So the Piraeus Apollo, an amazing example of hollow bronze casting, and another example, but in marble. This is a copy of a 5th century, in a high classical, in marble, showing that you have naturalism, but within the context of idealism. If you all go away with the idea of naturalism, ideal naturalism, that is the high classical thing. So another very important issue that I want to discuss, I've never discussed it in a talk before, I've never discussed it in a talk before, but the fact is that everything we have that is marble, and a lot of the bronzes as well, are damaged. Okay? That may not be interesting to you, but it's massively interesting to me. This beautiful, wonderful torso has got no head, no arms, and one leg gone, and the rest of the other leg gone, no feet, no hands, no head, no anything. And we see that as absolutely beautiful, because the more you take away, the more condensed, the more powerful is the image. Now, that idea of brokenness is embraced in the 19th century in the art schools of Europe as what is classical. Classical is broken. Classical is grainy and grey. Classical is mutilated. If you saw it as it had been, you wouldn't want to look at it because it would have been brightly painted in very bright colours. You don't know what, you would have been appalled if you saw it as it really was. So it is so much part of what classical is that when Rodin makes his figures, he actually embraces that idea of brokenness as part of the quality of the image. Can you all see what I'm saying? Is that a new idea to anybody? Well, it should be. So the point is, well, I don't mean that in a nasty way. What I mean is that with Winkelmann, with Winkelmann, who was the great collector and tremendous classicist of the 9th century, he spread the love of classics all around Europe. He established the museums, took the things, and with him came this idea that classical sculpture is broken. This drawing is the kind of thing you would do in any art school in Europe in the 19th century when you're learning. And you would be made to do drawing over and over again, and everything you drew would be broken. I know I'm ramming it home, but it's important. And you would do it in the utmost perfect, absolutely perfect, totally perfect, all around the torso, the tension here of the muscles and everything else. And then you'd suddenly have a complete breakdown of form. This is the famous Belvedere torso that's in the Vatican Museum. I've just seen it, well, I saw it last year because it came to England. And this drawing is made not from the actual Belvedere torso, but from a plaster cast. And nearly all art schools had plaster casts. And it was made by Pablo Picasso at the age of 11 years old. I did want to show you, but I thought it would be cruel, that exactly the same drawing done by a very famous English artist, which looks like a collapsing meringue, where the knees sort of come to knobs and end in knobs, and the whole body is sagging to the left, and it's got no tension, no muscle, anything. And that drawing was made in art school by J.M.W. Turner. But I decided not to be unkind. So that's the actual thing, and you can see how very, very cleverly Picasso, at the age of 11 years old, from a plaster cast, made the drawing. Okay, this carving had an immense influence on Michelangelo, his great prophets on the Sistine ceiling, his great figures on the tomb of Julius. All of those figures were influenced because this was in Rome. So it all depends on where these things were. As we go on with Rodin, we are, as I've tried to explain, although he's deeply embedded in classical tradition, he is also attracted to the romance of Hellenism, which is where you begin to get much more movement. This figure here, which is actually from the west pediment of the Parthenon, which is high classical, is not quite Hellenistic, but you're moving towards it with the sort of wet t-shirt effect of the wind blowing the chiton against the body, movement, and that is coming much more towards Hellenism. This Rodin shows us a combination of all these things. You've got the movement that I was talking about, you've got the mutilation that I've been talking about, and it's also cast in bronze. Part of the body is complete, which is the torso, the breast, the arm, and the hand. You don't know where the head is going or anything else. So you have this concentration of energy and form, and we see that as beautiful. We have been, nobody would look at that and say it's unfinished. Why didn't he finish? Nobody would ever say that. And another one also very unfinished, very broken, but this one is different because this one does not reference any of the classical sculptures. It probably may draw on the body language of a can-can, which he would have seen a lot because obviously he was in Paris. But the shine on the bronze is amazing, and the way the form of the arm and leg fuse into one big form is also very interesting, and all I can say is that Rodin is a complete genius. And the most famous Rodin is the kiss, which again seems to allude to Greek mythology. The body is twisting very gently. Again, it's very, very beautiful. It's ideal, but it's ideal naturalism. 1890, we're heading towards the end of the century. We're going to sink into what we call the fin de siècle, which is actually rather a decadent period in many ways. But the kiss is beautiful there, going back to Canova in the 18th century and then to the ancient Greeks. An extraordinarily beautiful work. But he was interested in twisting and turning the body in all sorts of different directions, and he was a master with marble as he was with bronze, and this beautiful figure of the figure bending down with the head turning and the hair, his Danae. The other thing that we take for granted when we look at the works of Rodin is the fact that he will often have the figure emerging from the natural material from which it's made, in this case emerging from the marble. We're so used to that we don't say, why didn't he cut the rest away? Why didn't he put it on a plinth? Why didn't he label it? But we don't say that. There's something about the emergence of the form from raw, natural, uncontrolled, natural material. And you see, he saw that in the Michelangelos. In England, we've got the most beautiful Michelangelo. It's unfinished. You can see all the claw marks. When he was looking at, for example, the dying slaves in Florence, he would have seen that, exactly that same thing. So, in fact, when you see something that's finished, like the David of Michelangelo, it doesn't have quite the same punch. As an expressionist, you see, Rodin, yes, he has the classical tradition behind him, but he is a man of his time, and the romantic tide that is carrying everybody else is also carrying him. So he is one of the great expressionists. And you look at this amazing figure of a person that was historic, an historic figure called Pierre de Wissant, who was one of the Burghers of Calais, and you can see how much Rodin could do with wordlessly, just with forms. The Romantic movement, which starts in Germany, actually some people came in late, it sweeps down, it's originally literature and poetry, it comes into art, and the great romantics are Lord Byron. I'll go no more roaming so late into the night, though the heart be still as loving and the moon be still as bright. Or the greatest of all in music, Beethoven. Fidelio is such a great romantic work, it had to be banned. It wasn't banned, but it wasn't performed, because it was such a great work, romantic work. And the romantic thing is not lovey-dovey and soft. It's tough and masculine. Ideas about the solitude of man in the immensity of nature, ideas about the nighttime and death, about love and death, about moonlight, and about all these sorts of ideas are the things that fuel romanticism. And of course, they were slightly elbowed out by the arrival of realism, because most people are pretty realist. They all took to realism, and therefore they took to Impressionism. What is Impressionism? It's just another form of realism. It's what you see. You go out in the River Seine, you see this. Really, Impressionism is just another form of realism. But this man somehow glided past all of that, and he kept the Romanticism alive. And in the Burghers of Calais, you get a very powerful statement. It's about self-sacrifice. These burghers are going to hand the keys of their city, Calais, over to the English, and they're going to give themselves as hostage, their own lives, and they are all the elders of the town, and they're all, of course, based on real figures, and they're very, very powerful. Having done the Burghers of Calais, his greatest work, he said, was his Balzac. Balzac, one of the great, great writers of France, and he pounds Balzac. He is determined that the personality of Balzac will come through. He went up to where Balzac was born. He talked to all the people that had known him. He walked around the fields where he'd walked, he read everything, and he produced this incredible, powerful image, which I'm afraid to say has given birth to a lot of very shapeless sculpture people that think that shapelessness is powerful. It isn't. It has to have the meaning behind it. But as we get right to the end, we have his Gates of Hell. And I don't think you might not know them because they were never actually produced. A massive, massive model, including over 200 figures that are falling in total chaos. Right at the top, a thinker there, which we do know of course, was reproduced. And all these figures, 200 figures, falling down. The Gates of Hell was made over quite a long period of time, at about the same time, or not long after, this publication by Gustave Doré, who illustrated Paradise Lost. And the words of Paradise Lost, him the almighty power hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky, when Satan is thrown down and thrown out of heaven. Another image from Paradise Lost in engravings shows again how all the angels are falling out of heaven and coming down to earth. These images of chaos tell us that we're near the end of the century and something big's going to happen. Of course, Rodin had seen the famous Last Judgment in the Vatican, and he'd seen figures like that figure, which probably inspired his thinker. He'd seen the figures falling and tumbling everywhere. He'd also seen the works of El Greco that were in Paris at about the same time. This is the opening of the Fifth Seal, which again is a very extraordinary work, where all the figures appear to be plugged into an electric socket. The electricity is powering through these figures. He's lost any interest in what real figures really look like. Electricity is swirling through them and deforming them. And that energy, and up here, I'm afraid this is only a detail, so I can't show you. Here is St. John. So these are the kind of images, and of course El Greco is one of the first expressionists, long before Rodin, but one of the first expressionists. So these are some of the images from the Gates of Hell. And this work was made at almost exactly the same time. I was going to get Matthew, but he disappeared. I wanted to play you a few bars from the Saint-Saëns organ concerto. Yes, the organ concerto was written at exactly the same time, and it's massively, massively powerful. The huge organ thundering. And when you look at these, and when you listen to the organ concerto, Matthew's disappeared. I did forget, I'm afraid, at the last minute. You can imagine that. You know, I don't want to sing it, but I'm sure you know it. Very, very powerful, thundering, and this sort of announcing that something very dark is coming. Now, the other great influence feeding into Rodin was the work of the late Hellenistic sculptures, of which most famously is the Laocoon, which he would have seen as well. He would have seen it, even though it came from Rhodes, he would have seen it because it was in Italy, where you have the priests of Laocoon twisting and bending and struggling and about to die. This image of the Laocoon's head twisted back, full of emotion, mouth open, eyes, this is absolutely about as Hellenistic as you get. And it is this kind of Hellenism that comes through to Rodin. So as we look at this image, we see the world is hanging by its nails as we're about to embark on the 20th century. I'm now going to, still got plenty of time, so I'm now going to tell you what happened next, right? We're at this point, we've been through all of that, and now we're going to find images of anxiety, this beautiful work by Rodin, images of hopelessness and farewell, amazing image as well. And as the 19th century dies, Europe was about to embark on a dangerous love affair, and against all the traditions that had made European culture great. And that was a rejection of everything that was classical, everything that was European, everything was Christian, and against the rule of law. And it was going to be an embracing of everything that was primitive, pagan, and anti-European. So this is coming closer at the very end of the 19th century, and we see it primarily first through the work of Paul Gauguin. Gauguin went off to Tahiti because he hated the disease of civilization. He evoked a marvelous, pure, natural world, so he wanted to say, that wasn't burdened by all the things like the rule of law, like the moral code, and all the things that we'd had for centuries. And he also couches his world in very strange psychedelic colors, as if it's a vision. The colors bear no relation to the real world. He divorces color from reality. That's one of the things Gauguin did. There's a darkness and unease within Gauguin, initially idealized and they're mythological depictions of Tahiti and its inhabitants, but there is something quite dark about it. And last night on my balcony, discussing it with my friends, we discussed the darkness in Gauguin. They are looking into the water. We don't see what they're looking at, these girls. But they're not wearing dress of any kind. They're not wearing European dress. The light is clearly not European. Nothing about it is to do with any European tradition. We have a painting here which suggests that this girl is a sort of Polynesian Eve, appearing in an unpoisoned paradise. So these words here, this painting is actually called The Words of the Devil. The thing about Gauguin was many of these paintings were not actually painted from real subjects in Tahiti. They were made up. Quite a lot of the objects in them were actually New Zealand objects that he found in a museum. And although they're wonderful paintings, they're not true paintings. They're not real paintings. And that's why he fought with Van Gogh so much, because Van Gogh believed passionately that you portray what's there is the greatest thing you can portray. These paintings were so unreal, so exotic, that people were swept away by them. You can see here he casts himself as quite an evil creature looking down at these girls. And combined with the flattening of the form, combined with the complete absence of natural light, normal light, you see, I have to backtrack a bit. When you think of Impressionism, the thing Impressionists did, it looked for ordinary natural light on ordinary things, on the real world, particularly light on water, right? Ordinary light on, get out of the studio, stop arranging your light, have natural light on the real world. Let's breathe and have the real world. That's Impressionism. But here there isn't really any natural light either. They are extraordinary visionary paintings. They are very frequently include idols. Very, very often there's one that's called the Day of the God, which has a big wooden totem and people dancing around it. And the colors are very, very psychedelic. So these are the paintings. He tried to kill himself with arsenic, but he was so big and tough he survived. And in fact, he could have just eaten his paints. They're probably mostly full of arsenic as well. But he survived. So his paintings are very strange. This one is called Nevermore. It's in the Cortot collection. Right at the end of the 19th century, the woman is lying on that acid green. And that acid green color is a color of chronic anxiety. If I had a bit more time, I could explain how you see it in the work of Pablo Picasso, in Picasso's Weeping Woman that he made with the Spanish Civil War. It's very acid yellow. You see it in a lot of Van Gogh's self-portraits. You see it in late Botticelli as well. It's a color of chronic, have we got it in this one? It's a color of really chronic anxiety. You see it on this figure. So this acid yellow. And in the window is the black crow, the black raven. And the picture's called Nevermore. But Gauguin went out of his way to say that it had nothing whatsoever to do with Edgar Allan Poe. However, one doesn't know. So all of these shapes are quite, you look into these shapes here and you'll see really strange things. It wasn't only Gauguin, it was also Henri Matisse. Matisse made this great work called The Blue Nude in just after the beginning of the 20th century, where he didn't even attempt to make this woman beautiful or obedient to any classical canon. He made her extremely with violent shapes and violent extreme forms, and it was bought by Clarabelle Cohn, who was a doctor from Baltimore. And it was quite extraordinary that the Cohn sisters bought all these extreme paintings. When it went to America, they burnt effigies of this painting. So the point is, he's doing something different. Gauguin said that he discovered a profound and mysterious language, which was a language of dream. We have to remember that Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams was just about being published. So there was a great interest in psychological realism, in the psychological reality. Matisse's work, The Happiness of Life, was made in 1905, is a really good example because he projects the idea of a golden age sited somewhere in the midi of France where there is no work, no illness, no death, no children, no disease, no men, the odd token one perhaps, but and where it's always sunny, it's wonderful, and it really is paradise without the serpent. This painting was painted with that whole idea in mind, that we are seeking a new kind of paradise that eliminates the whole Judeo-Christian tradition once and for all. And you can see the influence of Gauguin in the flatness of the colors. Can you all see? Yeah? So you can see, when Matisse was down at Collioure, he went to Serré, a little town called Serré, where there was a friend of Gauguin who had a lot of Gauguin paintings, and he saw the Gauguins firsthand. He also came back to Paris in 1905, and he was on the committee, he was in charge of the hanging of the Van Gogh exhibition, the first Van Gogh. So he got very close to Gauguin and Van Gogh. Now, we go in for a real jungle when we get to Henri Rousseau. And Rousseau not only painted what he perceived of as real jungle, but he also was a naive painter, which ticked every box. And the one person who loved him was Pablo Picasso, who was one of the young Turks trying to break out of the mold. But you see the snakes are coming up. Look at them, they're everywhere, they're terrifying. Look at the snakes. And so this is the famous snake charmer by Henri. Look at them coming out of the trees. It's quite terrifying. So this is somewhere in the African jungle, the sun is burning, the snakes are coming out. And all of these works and this whole feeling that somehow the zeitgeist is moving was very much enhanced by Joseph Conrad. We were talking about this last night as well. His book, The Heart of Darkness, it was first published as a serial in 1899 and then as a book in 1902. And it was about a voyage up the Congo River, which he himself undertook. And it whipped up a great storm in France, as France was a major colonial power. Just let me finish. I've got 1 minute, please. So it whipped up this huge interest, and central to his thesis was the idea that there wasn't much difference between civilized people, so-called, and the people described as savages in the book. Wasn't much difference. So this had an enormous impact. And this was just around the time of the World Fair. Is it any surprise, with that background knowledge that you have, that Rousseau's paintings were so popular? Again, showing somebody in a jungle with a crocodile, somebody else with a flute player, all painted in the Zoo and the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. Now, just to show you, these are the paintings of Rousseau. We are now in a real jungle, not even pretending to be. And now we come finally to Picasso, where I want to explain. Pablo Picasso made this study, which you probably may not have seen. You can see that this girl somehow looks almost like perhaps a portrait, maybe in the European style. It's a three-quarter bust. From the side with the head turning, it's not far from any kind of traditional three-quarter bust. And yet the face is transforming into something completely different. In the autumn 1906, he started working on the bordel. He never ever